So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's talk, The Makings of the People's Game, Football in Dublin 1880 to 1970. And this is one of the Teatime Talks by 14 Henrietta Street. And for those of you who haven't been before, there are a series of talks inspired by the history and people of 14 Henrietta Street, which is a museum in Dublin 1 that tells the social history of Dublin life from the Georgian beginnings of one building to when it was a tenement. And 14 Henrietta Street is run by Dublin City Council Culture Company, which runs cultural initiatives in buildings across the city with and for the people of Dublin. And my name is Kate, and in a few moments I'm going to hand over to our speaker for this evening. But before I do, I just want to let you know that there will be time for questions at the end of the talk. If you have a question for our speaker, you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen and type your question in there, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. This talk is also being recorded, so if you had a friend or someone who couldn't make it this evening, or you have to leave halfway through, we will be sharing the recording at a later date across our channels. And if you want to know when that's available, the best way to do that is to sign up to our newsletter, where you'll also hear about other events that we run. So I'll pop the link in the chat box there in a minute. So our speaker today is Gerard Farrell, who is a member of the Bohemian Football Club and the Bohemian Foundation. Gerry is a Dublin-based football enthusiast and historian with an interest in the League of Ireland, the Irish national team, and the wider social significance of the game. He runs the Bohemian Sporting Life blog and podcast, and also contributes to the Bohemian FC website and programme, the Irish national team match programmes, the official League of Ireland website, and various other football websites, journals, and publications. And the Bohemian Foundation is an independent, non-profit organisation which is intent on improving the health and well-being of its North Dublin community. And the foundation runs its own initiatives, but also collaborates with Dublin City Council and others in a range of activities towards the shared objectives of improved health, well-being, and community development and social inclusion. So we're delighted to have Gerry with us here this evening. So without further ado, I will hand over to him for the talk.
Thanks very much, Kate. And it's great to hear that there's so many of you signed up for the talk, and it really is flattering, and I'm delighted that you've given up your afternoon to hear me talk about football in Dublin. As Kate has kind of introduced the talk there, it's less about the history of football in Dublin, although I do go through like a chronological history. I'm more interested in the stories and the social aspect and the impact football has on wider society. And I find football a very interesting lens, which gives you a view into wider society and how people function and things like that, because I think it's a very accessible route into history as well, and often one that's underappreciated and underserved in terms of research and even storytelling. And I'm sure some of you watching this evening have your own stories to tell, and I'd love to hear more from you as well about your own experiences of football in the city. But onwards with the history bit. My first slide is talking about the early beginnings of football in Dublin. Now, we can go back even before the 1880s when I kind of start my talk. There's a great quote here I have from Paul Rouse's History of Sport. And it goes back, he quotes from Faulkner's Dublin Journal in 1766, reported that there was a great match of football that was played in Milltown. So obviously the former site of Shamrock Rovers' home ground, to the great scandal of religion and great scandal to this metropolis. So you can see in the 1760s, a version of football was kind of scandalizing the newspaper writers of the day. Now, the version of football they're talking about is very, very dissimilar to what we would know as football today. It was kind of a large folk game, and basically the only similarities were that a ball of some variety was propelled by hand or foot by a group of men towards a goal. Now, what that goal was varied depending where it was played, and there was no cohesive set of rules that everyone obeyed or followed. I suppose what we have in the late Victorian period, the late 19th century, is you have sets of rules that are becoming agreed upon. And when you have an agreed set of rules, you can then play more matches. You can then invite other sides, other institutions to play against you on an agreed set of rules. So the FA have an agreed set of rules in Britain from 1863 onwards. There is a slow uptake of football in Ireland. There were matches in the 1870s. Traditionally, the first match that's cited is one that's organised in Belfast in 1879. But we do know that there were matches of association football, or soccer, as sometimes it referred, soccer coming from the word association, in other parts of the country even before 1879. So there were other matches in places like Sligo and Lismore and other places like that. In Leinster, we know basically there was matches in the early 1880s, and in Dublin specifically, and we're focusing on Dublin, the first matches that we can confirm were in 1882, where there was a practice match played in Trinity College, but the first clubs were really formed in 1883. So in just off O'Connell Street, Dublin Association Football Club was formed in 1883, and a few weeks later, Trinity College students formed the Dublin University Football Club. Now, Trinity College had a rugby team since the 1850s, and if you think about it, all these sports, rugby, association football, Gaelic football, they often have shared roots, but then they're codified in different ways, and what is agreed upon by one set becomes rugby union or rugby league or association football and so on. So that first Dublin derby was in 1883 between Dublin AFC and Dublin University Football Club. There's a great description of the goalkeeper for Trinity College or Dublin University, wearing a tweed jacket and smoking a pipe as he kept goal for the team. So not a hugely professional standard, certainly a very amateur standard, but early days in association football in Dublin. And I suppose it's not really uncommon for Trinity College and university students to be involved, because a lot of those early football matches were associated with basically students from elite private schools here in Ireland, but also in England, where Irish students would be studying in schools like Stonyhurst and then returning back to Dublin with games they had learned in the English public school system or university teams. So some of the photographs that I put up there, on the left is Oliver St. John Gogarty. He went to Stonyhurst School in England. He was a boarder there, and he returned to Dublin and began playing football in the 1880s for Bohemian Football Club and won a Leinster Senior Cup with Bohemians. The other gentleman at the top there is the wonderfully named Manliff Goodbody. He was a bit of an all-rounder. He was an Irish international as a footballer, but also he was a very talented tennis player. He contested the final of the US Open and made the semi-final of Wimbledon as a doubles player. And down the bottom is an interesting character, another Stonyhurst graduate, Gonzalo Canilla. He was from Gibraltar. His uncle was actually the Archbishop of Gibraltar. He came to Britain to study in Stonyhurst and then came to Dublin to study in the Royal College of Surgeons. And while he was training to be a doctor, he played cricket and football here in Dublin. He played for Bohemians, and he also played for a team called Freebooters, who were based around roughly Simmons Court, RDS, that part of Ballsbridge. So you can see from just this handful of individuals I picked, there are plenty more that I could have picked. These are from educated professional classes and associated with kind of elite private schools and universities. So, and like with Gogarty, Gonzalo, and Manliff, who were all talented sportsmen across a field of sports, they were very interested in the broader sporting culture. And you got to remember, at the end of the 19th century, there was this real interest in physical improvement, what's called muscular Christianity, that it is almost beholden on young men especially, and it is really men we're talking about, to become fit and athletic, and this is almost considered a moral good. And this is also incorporated into a lot of Gaelic revival ideology as well, and we'll come to the GAA later, but they take a similar, although slightly more nuanced viewpoint. So again, that's the early days. Now, there's a timeline as well. The 1880s is a kind of haphazard. There's no real official leagues. There's occasional games, there's friendly matches, things like that. But it becomes formalized based from the late 1880s and into the 1890s. And you really get to see structures that you will still recognize now and institutions you'll still recognize now. So it's the 1880s, as I say, are a key decade. My own club, Bohemian Football Club, was founded in September 1890. The man on the bottom left-hand corner in the fetching hat there is a guy called Dudley Hussey. As a teenager, he was involved with the forming of Bohemians, and he was the secretary of the club and the man who actually passed the casting vote to decide on the name Bohemians. There was actually discussion of whether Bohs should actually be called Rovers. But as well as being involved with Bohemians, Dudley Hussey was also involved in the foundation of the Leinster Football Association, or LFA, a couple of years later, and he was also the first secretary of the LFA. And the Leinster Football Association is really the governing body for football clubs, because not only were Bohs founded in 1890, in the late 1880s, early 1890s, a number of other clubs around the city were being founded, and they were looking for teams to play against, matches to play. After that, 1894, you have the foundation of the Leinster Senior League. A couple of years before that, with the foundation of the LFA, you have the Leinster Senior Cup. So the Leinster Senior League and Leinster Senior Cup are still competed for today. If you read any kind of sports section of a newspaper, you'll still see their fixtures listed. The Leinster Football Association still organise a lot of those leagues and cups. So they're still in existence today. By 1895, you have the foundation of Shelbourne. Again, the new Dublin derby begins to emerge from that, because quite quickly, by the end of the 1890s, Bohs and Shelbourne become the two dominant teams in the Leinster Senior League and Leinster Senior Cup. And like the idea of the Dublin derby between Dublin University and Dublin AFC, this becomes the first real Dublin derby, Bohs and Shells, and that's a rivalry, a friendly competitive rivalry that maintains for decades after that. So there are some key landmark dates. And obviously by the end of the 1890s, this is all well established. You have other clubs being formed by like Shamrock Rovers a few years later. And then what you have in the very early part of the 20th century is you have clubs like Bohemians and Shelbourne competing in the Irish League. Now, just a bit of background here. Football in Ireland, up until the split, which we'll come to later, the split in 1921, is run by the IFA, the Irish Football Association, the fourth oldest football association in the world. They're based in Belfast. The LFA, the Leinster Football Association, very quickly affiliate to them in 1892, and the overall, I suppose, governing of the game in Ireland is down to the IFA, and they have a league. Now, the Irish League, as it's called, is very much Belfast dominated, but Bohs and Shells are the first Dublin clubs to compete in it, and there are other teams as well. There's teams from Derry and so on, and then eventually you have other teams like Glenavon from Lurgan and so on. But I suppose we need to talk about why football began to grow and find roots in Dublin. Now, like I said, Belfast became an early hotbed of football in Ireland, and there was a lot of conditions that made it very successful there. But while it didn't grow as quickly in Dublin, it did still take a real foothold. So why did it grow quickly in Dublin, and why does it suit Dublin? Well, first and foremost, association football, soccer, suits cities. If you're playing rugby, if you're playing Gaelic, if you're playing hurling, these are games you really do need multiple players, large amounts of players, like several. You can play soccer with one mate in the back lane. You can play soccer in a laneway, kicking a ball against the wall. You can't really play rugby in that way. You need open space, you need lots of players, you need grass. And in a lot of other cases, in other sports, like cricket, other sports, you need more equipment. So there's a cost factor as well. So you need space and you need equipment, and it needs to be kind of specialized. So even with hurling, you need a hurl. Rugby, you need a specific rugby ball. It can't really, whereas football, and it's one of the things that crops up in the oral records that Kate has shown me from Henrietta Street, that kids in Dublin could make a ball out of anything, about ball up socks, newspapers, rags, that sort of thing. John Giles in his autobiography talks about playing football with a bouncer, which is a small solid rubber ball that bounces all over the place. But obviously something, when you're playing with a ball like that in a narrow or cobbled street, ball bouncing either way and so on, it means you can basically develop your skill, your close control. And this idea of the street footballer, the city footballer, which is pervasive in all footballing societies. I mean, the Argentinians would look at someone like Diego Maradona as the epitome of the street footballer. I'll come to it later, but Dublin City, when you talk about it, I suppose for me, the epitome would be someone like, say, Wes Houlihan, or people might say someone who's, again, is from Portland Row in the North Inner City. But there's a lot of examples like him as well, the technically astute, clever street footballer. So Dublin, as a city, we have the Phoenix Park, which is great, but when you're in the city centre, there's not a huge amount of green space. So you're limited in the sports you can play. You might have 2 mates, you might have 20 mates. No matter how many you have, you can still play a version of football. while Dublin is less industrialised than Belfast, you do see a rise of works teams as well, because very quickly teams are formed throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century in all walks of life. So the photograph you can see on the left is the St. James's Gate team. They were formed in 1902. That's a photograph from the 1920s. Now, St. James's Gate obviously are associated with the St. James's Gate Brewery and Guinness's. Now, they're probably the most famous of the works teams, but there are loads of works teams. Jacob's Biscuits have a works team. There is a team called Midland Athletic, which is associated with the railways. And again, like a club like Dundalk, a bit up the road, are formed out of the railways as well. So there's a lot of works teams, and these are just ones who've competed at a high level. There are works teams associated with, department stores, printers, and you name it, there's a works team associated with that business. There are also teams associated with groups like the YMCA. There are teams associated with churches. There are teams associated with individual streets or houses. So Shelburne, being an example, are named after the Shelburne Road. Shamrock Rovers are named after Shamrock Avenue in Ringsend. So these, again, were small, very local teams that are formed really around the locality. Some disappear after a couple of years. Some become amalgamated with other teams and become more well known. So Home Farm, I live in Drumcondra. Home Farm is associated with Home Farm Road. Now, they were, again, playing these street leagues. They amalgamated with a team from Richmond Road, and then eventually they became the famous nursery club who developed so many great footballers. So you name it, there is a football team from those different groups. One of the early teams was Pioneers, and of course they're associated with the temperance movement. So you have all these different teams. Now, one we should kind of mention is the idea that football in Ireland is a garrison game. And one of those organizations that does provide teams, provide quality opposition, especially in the late 19th century, is the military. There is a big British military presence in Dublin. There are thousands of soldiers based around the city. There are large barracks in Beggar's Bush, or what we now know as Collins Barracks on the North Quays, but which was back then known as the Royal Barracks. So there are lots of regiments there. Most regiments, as a way to keep fit, keep healthy, are involved in sports, and there will be regimental football teams. And especially in the early 90s, they provided a quality sort of opposition, because a lot of those soldiers would be from England and Scotland, where maybe football was a bit more advanced than in 1890s Dublin. So they are a part of the story, but I do think the idea of that football as a quote unquote garrison game is completely overplayed. And the role and significance, I think, of army regiment teams really is kind of very much as a background issue by the early 20th century. They're not an elite level opposition really by then, and especially not by the time the League of Ireland is formed. So, I mean, that is, I'll come back to points on the garrison game after that, but they are part of the story. Although, like I said, in Dublin and elsewhere, I think the role of the military is somewhat overplayed. Now, the other reason, and it's kind of political, why there is a growth in football, especially in the 1890s, you saw that slide before, you saw the amount of growth in the 1890s, is that there is a huge internal division within the GAA. So the GAA are obviously quite tightly connected with Irish politics and Irish culture, understandably. And also a lot of very prominent people within Irish society are associated with the GAA. They're patrons of the GAA. But there is a split in the GAA, as there is a split in the Irish Parliamentary Party over, I suppose, the personal life of Charles Stewart Parnell, the fact that he is named in divorce proceedings involving his partner, Catherine O'Shea, who is married to Captain O'Shea, who is also an Irish Parliamentary Party MP. And this causes scandal, and there is a split within the public, within the membership of the IPP, the Irish Parliamentary Party, but there's also a split within the GAA. I'm just going to give you a quick quote on that. So, on the Parnellite split in the 1890s, Michael Cusack, obviously one of the founding members of the GAA, expressed confidence in our patron Charles Stewart Parnell. So important to note, Parnell was a patron of the GAA, and of course Parnell Park in Dublin, in Donnycarney, is named after him, and pledged to follow him under the green flag of an independent Ireland. And that endorsement by Michael Cusack was endorsed by the GAA on a national level, but that wasn't to everyone's liking. There was a schism in the GAA, And one of the most notable critics of that was Archbishop Thomas Croke. Now, Croke is obviously a patron of the GAA as well, has quite a famous stadium named after him as well. So Archbishop Thomas Croke then referred to Parnell as a measly pig in a litter that succeeds in infecting all the rest. And he made this very public denouncement, and there was a big split in loyalties, and really it did huge damage to the GAA at the time. And over this split, basically there was space for football, which is already growing as a sport, to organize and win the hearts and minds, because people are disillusioned with the GAA, the disillusioned with the politicization of stances made by people. So there's a chance for them to join a football club, especially when a lot of those football clubs, like I said, are associated maybe with where they work or where they live, or an organization separately which they're involved with, but doesn't carry that political baggage. And we'll come back to some of the issues around the split and the role and relationship with the GAA a little bit later. One, just having mentioned the Royal Barracks, or Collins Barracks, where the Exmouth National Museum is now, I couldn't leave it out just mentioning this little story. It's a little bit of an aside, but if any of you know the Croppy Acre, which is now a public park on Wolftown Quay, it's now a public park. It's little used. It's there in front of the Collins Barracks Museum. Back then, it was known as the Esplanade. And what's an esplanade or esplanade? It is where obviously the army worked out. It was training grounds, drill ground, field grounds. So back when it was still a barracks and the Irish Army were still based there, they did a fundraising match. So they had an Irish Army Celebrity 11. They had a Celebrity 11 versus an Irish Army 11. And who did they get to play in that game? It was part of a fundraiser as well for Shea Brennan, the former Man United player, Irish international, who had kind of fallen on hard times and had some health issues around the time. In 1986, George Best played a football match on what is now known as, I suppose, the Croppy Acre, in front of temporary stands with about 1,500 to 2,000 people. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture there of a bearded George Best, about 40 years of age, playing football on the Croppy's Acre with a dog wandering onto the pitch as well. And it was too good a story not to tell there. On the left-hand side is just an old Ordnance Survey map image showing it, the Croppy's Acre listed as the Esplanade, as it was back, I think, in 1913. But I just couldn't resist the story of George Best playing basically on a quayside in Dublin in front of about 1,500 people in a fundraising match against an Irish Army select and dogs walking on the pitch. It was just, it's stranger than fiction, really. Moving on, though, I did say I've been really talking about men so much so far, and you would be forgiven for thinking that women's football is a very modern phenomenon, and we've seen a great growth in women's sport in Ireland, and great growth in women's football around the world as well, and in participation levels and viewing figures. But women were playing football way back into the 19th century. I've just selected 3 clippings here. I could have selected any number of them, but these 3 kind of tell a little story. On the left is about a ladies' football match, as it's described. A touring side has come over from Britain, and they're playing in 1896, and they play in Jones's Road, which of course nowadays is known as Croke Park. But back then, the 1890s, it was a multi-use sports ground. It was owned by a city councillor called named Butterley, and it was hired out to all sorts of different people. So Bohemians played their home games in 1893 in Jones's Road. Back when the time when the GAA were actually playing All-Ireland finals in Clontarf Park up the road a little bit further north in Drumcondra. So it really didn't become the definite permanent home of the GAA. I think it was actually until 1913. So there was actually a women's football match there in 1896. Now, you can't really see the article there, but obviously they have some pen pics of the players. It's quite complimentary in some ways, although there are a lot of very old-fashioned sexist stereotypes that you would expect from, I suppose, a newspaper from the 1890s. The game actually took place a day later because the newspapers say that, because women are terrible at telling time and couldn't organise themselves to get the train down from Belfast where they played a match on time. More likely, actually, when looking into it, is actually down to the man who was organising the tour was holding out for extra money and delayed the players from visiting in 1896. And they played a match in Jones's Road to quite a large crowd and were quite well received and quite popular. Now, the second piece you see there is from a Northern Ireland newspaper called the Northern Wig. And this is quite scathing of, I suppose, attitudes in Dublin towards women's football. Because at the time, women's football in Northern Ireland had undergone, especially around Belfast, had undergone something of a boom. So even someone like, say, Selena Blanchflower, who's the mother of Danny and Jackie Blanchflower, who had such success at Tottenham Hotspur and Man United, respectively. She was an excellent football player herself. They got their football skills from her, not from their father. Their father was actually a milkman and jazz musician on the side. Selena had won cups as a footballer for her works team. But there's a story of a French women's team coming to play. They play a match in Belfast. They're available to play a match in Dublin, but this is basically turned down. And you can see, I'll just read a bit of the text here. This is obviously a Northern newspaper kind of looking down on Dublin attitudes with glee, showing how unreconstructed we are. I'm wondering if the word ban with two N's is a pun on the river as well. But it says, the censoring of posters, films, jazz dance, silk stocking, and bob hair are some of the many activities of the Free State Purity League. The latest development is a ban on lady footballers. Consequently, the French ladies football team, who delighted Belfast football enthusiasts with a brilliant exhibition of ladies soccer, cannot play in Dublin, as all playing grounds are forbidden to them. The Southern Church hold very pronounced views on the subject of ladies' attire and also have an opinion that football is not a women's game. Now, they're taking this kind of high and mighty position, and as they mentioned, that this French women's team had played to some acclaim in Belfast, but that wasn't to be the case for all that much longer. In Britain, basically, women's football had endured something of a boom during the First World War and in the early 20s, but very quickly after that, the FA banned women's football from the use of any FA sanctioned ground, and very quickly that kind of that ban had a huge effect on football in Northern Ireland as well. Unfortunately, women's football, in many cases, even in what we now know as the Republic of Ireland, back then would have been referred to as the Free State, didn't really get going much at that time, didn't really get that level of organisation. And really, we didn't have a proper women's international team until 1973. And even the challenges our own women's national team have faced in the recent years with simple issues about, tracksuits and so on, shows that we still have a long way to go. Just to mention there, the final pick is a nice photograph from, again, works teams. This is from the Dublin Evening Mail in 1959. The photographs are the office workers versus the factory workers of Healy's printers. So Healy's printers, I think they ended up being bought out by Smurfit Printing some years after that. They had their own sports grounds, and they had women's teams playing these works leagues, which right up to into the 1970s was the main route that women had to play football. They played in mostly female workplaces, so the likes of Vards Furriers or different teams would have women's football teams, especially when they had a large female workforce. So I just did want to mention that, because obviously a lot of the history focuses on football almost as if it's a purely male sport and male participation, but there were women footballers, although because of the views of officialdom, they were shunted to the side. And there was a lot of pseudoscience even at the time. You had doctors coming out saying that football was bad for women's health and it was dangerous for them to play it. So these bans were almost put across as very patriarchal, paternalistic sort of thing, that we're doing women a favor by not letting them play football because they don't realize it's bad for their health, which is kind of ridiculous when you look at it now with 21st century eyes. Just moving on to the next point here, I'm talking about was the growth and success of football. So when football becomes a big mass participation and mass viewing spectacle. So we've talked about the early days and the formation of clubs and formation of leagues and so on. But quite quickly comes to the elite level. So the first international match held in Dublin was 1900. It was held in Lansdowne Road. There was, of the 11 men who took the pitch, only one, a guy called George Sheehan from Bohemians, was actually a Dubliner. All the rest were Belfast players. Now the Irish team lost to England in that match. But the match went off quite well. It showed that Dublin could host games. In 1901, Bows by the land owned by a guy, or attributed to a guy called Pisser Dignam. I had no idea who Pisser Dignam was or how he got that name, but the land Dalymount is built on was known at the time as Pisser Dignam's Field. It was in behind the houses of Dalymount, and the club took it over in 1901. The first match was Bows versus Shells in September of 1901. And very quickly after that, the ground was begun to be developed, and stands were installed, terracing and so on. So quite quickly, Dalymount becomes an alternate venue for international matches, cup finals, cup semi-finals, and so on. And even in 1901, Bows are bringing over the likes of Glasgow Celtic and Preston North End, who were the significant English teams at the time. So they're bringing over big clubs to play in Dalymount and attracting big crowds. So around this time, as you see that the stat there, by the outbreak of the First World War, there's 150 clubs in Leinster affiliated to the Leinster Football Association, and the majority of them are in Dublin. And it's a big game. You can get 10 to 15,000 people at matches for big derby matches or cup finals and stuff like that are held in Dublin. So it is becoming a mass participation sport, but also a mass public spectacle. And also, as we were talking at the start, this was a game of the elite, professional classes, people from elite educational institutions. By this stage, it has changed an awful lot. So one of those early schools that kind of patronized football was Castleknock College, a Vincentian-run private secondary school. They abandoned association football really in favor of rugby in 1909. By this stage, by the kind of early, just before the First World War years, football is very much more taken on a working class character in terms of participation and spectators. So a couple of quotes there from the bottom. This is one ahead of a Bow Shells game. And as you can see there, it says, football depends to a great extent on the support of the working classes. Again, this is backed up in C.S. Andrews, or Todd Andrews, as he's more commonly known, autobiography, Dublin Made Me, where he talks that about a big match between Dublin and Shelburne, who were the big teams at the time when he was talking about this, being made up exclusively of the lower, middle and working classes. Todd Andrews was a decent enough footballer himself. He played for the university team at UCD, and his brother Paddy later went on to captain Bohemians and was also capped by Ireland. So he knows a bit about football himself. So again, you can see this class shift where really, even by the time of the outbreak of the First World War, you can say that football has become very much a game more associated with the working class rather than those elite private institutions that we were talking about maybe only 20 years earlier. And then, as I mentioned, we had the split. So there's a load of different reasons around the split from the IFA. Obviously, the fact that there was a war of independence going on, there was, there's a whole talk in and of itself about what was going on in Belfast, what was going on in Dublin, with the rest of the country, and so on. Purely from a footballing point of view, there's a split because of a few things. There's growing resentment about what is viewed as a kind of condescending attitude taken by the IFA towards Dublin, that players based outside of Belfast aren't being selected for national teams, that Dublin isn't getting significant matches, that most internationals, and obviously these are big money spinners, are taking place in Belfast, that most of the administration and the decisions are made by a kind of a Belfast elite. Now, this comes to a head over a few things. There are a few different flashpoints, one at an international amateur game in Paris, where kind of Irish tricolours are raised, and there's a bit of a diplomatic incident. There's a few other things about kind of junior cup finals, things like that, being withdrawn from Dublin, ostensibly because the area isn't safe. Now, Belfast wasn't particularly safe at the time as well, but it comes to a head when there's a replay that's due to take place between Shelburne and Glenavon in an Irish Cup game. The replay should take place in Dublin, but the IFA say no, it should happen in Belfast. And basically then the main Dublin clubs and the LFA say, look, we're disaffiliating, we're setting up, effectively the LFA is reset up as the FAI as we know today, or the FAI of the Football Association of Ireland, of the Irish Free State as it's known for a while. Either way, by the early 1920s, there is a separate organisation and separate league and separate cup competition. The first league and cup was actually won as a double by St James's Gate, who we showed earlier. That was part of the winning team. But the 20s basically quite quickly and quite successfully set up their own league and cup. So the first season, it's all Dublin clubs. But quite quickly that expands out, and the league welcomes teams from Cork, Fordsons, who again are a works team associated with the Ford factory in Cork. And the other clubs join in the 20s and 30s. Just focusing on the Dublin clubs here, from left to right, the first picture there is of the Bohemians team of 27-28, who won the League, Cup, Shield and Leinster Senior Cup. The top right is the Shelburne team of 1922. That's the cup final team that were actually beaten even after the split, by a Belfast team called Alton United. Now, Alton United were part of a thing called the Falls League, which is mainly made up of clubs who would be from what would be considered maybe nationalist parts of Belfast. They didn't want to affiliate to the IFA, so they are actually a Belfast team who affiliated to the IFA, or affiliated, sorry, to the FAI, and competed here against Dublin teams under the auspices of the FAI for a short period. And in the bottom there is the Shamrock Rovers team that won the league in 1923-24. Now, all those teams provided Irish internationals. The Irish international team, they sent the FAI sent a team to the 24 Olympics, and then they started playing international matches really from kind of 1926 onwards regularly. Dalymount becomes the focus because obviously there's no arguments over whether matches should take place in Belfast or Dublin. And the other interesting thing is the FAI can now shift focus onto developing football in other areas. So like I said, Cork had a team in the league by the late 20s. In the 30s, you have teams from the likes of Waterford, Sligo, Limerick, all joining the League of Ireland. So football is beginning to take root outside of the traditional areas where it had been dominant, which a lot of the time was really limited to Dublin and Belfast, with a few outliers, the likes of Athlone and so on. Although Sligo, like I said, has always been a bit of a hotbed. I'd just like to show some of the images here because we're talking about a time of mass popularity, mass participation in League of Ireland football and Irish internationals and so on. So this is Dalymount when it was, I suppose, the main football ground in Dublin. This is from 1956. It's a coloured photograph, an aerial shot, but you can see the crowds there. That's when, from 1956, when the Irish team beat West Germany, who were then world champions, 3-0. I don't think we'll be beating world champions 3-0 in any forthcoming internationals anytime soon, but it just shows the level of, the attendances at those matches, which is scary when you think about it now, were often over 40,000. I mean, the record for an FAI Cup final, and you've got to consider FAI Cup finals have since been held many times in Lansdowne Road or the Aviva Stadium, as it's dubbed. But the record for an FA Cup final attendance was the 1945 final between Bows and Rovers, where allegedly over 45,000 people squeezed into Dalymount, which is amazing and kind of shocking when you think about it. And I said I'd come back to this tension between the GAA and soccer, because you can see there in the previous slide how popular soccer was. Again, 40s and 50s, you have this rise of the League of Ireland, you have these big derbies, big fixtures. You got to remember, people, it was relatively cheap and affordable, so people could go and see a match as entertainment, probably in some cases more cheaply than they could go to the cinema. People didn't have TVs, and there was limited other forms of entertainment. So again, you might see a few reels in a cinema of, English football or things like that. You might see a few seconds of someone like Stanley Matthews, but really, unless they come to play in a match in Dublin, which a lot of the top stars in England did, they guested in games in Dublin, you're not going to see them on TV. You're only going to see the stars if you go to Talk Park or Dalymount or Milltown. And again, we look at this map here. You can see in the right-hand side, this is just from Google Maps. On the right-hand side, you can see the behemoth that is Croke Park. And really not all that far a walk away in Fitzroy, you can see Dalymount Park. So they're not at all far away from each other. And it's an interesting one there. I did a recent football walking tour that's run by Aon O'Riordan, the Labour Party TD, and Gary Cook, who most people would know as Eamon Dunphy from Appray Match. And they do a great tour around this area, and they talk about how that, despite Croke Park being the centre, GAHQ, the amount of players who are born around there who are really associated far more with association football. Eamon Dunphy, of course, being one. I'd like to just quote from Owen Hand, who was also born in Drumcondra. Well, he's actually born above the Brazen Head pub, but grew up in Drumcondra. And this is what Owen Hand recalled of growing up as a young man in the 50s and 60s. He said, I played hurling and game football and played soccer for Stella Maris. That was my greatest joy. In the 60s Ireland, however, that did not make me popular. Like many young footballers of the wrong persuasion, I received regular beatings from school from a particularly zealous Christian brother. He used a leather strap to show his disapproval of so-called foreign games. Basically, then after this, Owen's mother went up to the school and basically complained about these beatings. As a result, the brother didn't beat him with the strap anymore, but he said this was replaced by psychological warfare. He was isolated in the class. There was basically a ring of desks put around him so no one could sit near him. And he said that later on, he was invited back to the school as a guest of honor after he'd had success as an Irish international. And he basically told them that no way this Christian brother was going to be at that event. And he told no way in hell would he go near that school again. So again, that was a view that, Owen was then invited back when he had been a success, but he was being beaten because he was a soccer player. Probably the most famous case involved Liam Brady. And you remember this is in the early 70s. So Liam Brady attended St. Aidan's Christian Brothers School. They were due to play another school from Galway in a Gaelic football match at the same time that Brady had been called up to the Ireland schoolboy team to captain them against Wales. And apparently one of the Christian brothers in Brady's early autobiography called So Far So Good, Brady recounts that the brother told him, if you're not here on Saturday, obviously for the school game, then do not come into school on Monday. In fact, don't come back again. And when his father went up to inquire as to what he meant by this, he said, Mr. Brady, your boy is expelled. He's not to come back to school. Now, basically, this made the page of the Evening Herald that, a Christian brother had expelled a boy from school. And Liam Brady was due to sit his intercert exams as they were then. Eventually, he was allowed back to sit the intercert. But this is, think about it, that's a teenage boy. He's called up the Irish schoolboys to captain his country and is expelled for doing so because he won't play in a friendly match for the school's GAA team. And there's a lot of talk about this kind of discrimination, especially among Christian brothers, about boys who chose to play GAA. Eamon Dunphy mentions it in his book. John Jaws mentions it in his. And of course, at the time, up until 1971, there was a ban. So, as I mentioned, there was that Parnellite split in the 1890s. Where there was a ban on people playing foreign games, which, foreign games does not extend to baseball or American football or even rodeo sports, which were all hosted in Croke Park, or boxing or wrestling. Foreign games are really English games, or what's seen as English games. So association football, rugby, hockey, and cricket. And the ban was in place with some changes, basically from the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, up until 1971. And basically, not only were you banned from playing sport, and you can be banned for 2 years for attending a dance organized by another sports club. So if you went to a rugby club for a dance, you could be banned from the GAA for 2 years. You're also banned from watching sports. So if you went to Dalymount Park to watch a soccer international, you could be banned from the GAA. And they used to have a group called the Vigilance Committee, where there would be GAA members who would stand outside Dalymount Park or Lansdowne Road or Talk Park and look for prominent members of the GAA going into matches. And then they would report back so that person could be banned. Now, there's a funny story told by Mickey Whelan, the former Dublin player and selector, that he and Kevin Heffernan were spotted going into a match in Lansdowne Road. And the member of the Vigilance Committee who spotted them basically decided it wasn't worth his while reporting on them and just threw his eyes up to heaven. So it was often followed more in the spirit rather than in practice. But again, this was on the statute books up until 1971, which does seem kind of crazy in this battle for sporting hearts and minds. And there was this idea, and John Giles talks about it, that, if you played, and Owen Ham uses this term as well, if you played soccer, you were considered a corner boy. It was considered almost a betrayal of your country. There was all these phrases used of Orange Catholics or West Britons and so on, which is kind of ridiculous sort of terminology. And obviously a lot of very prominent people, even in the Irish independence movement, were as well associated with football. Oscar Traynor just being one prominent name, but there are dozens more, and something I've written on myself. But moving along as well, you can see, and there's some great photographs here sent to me my friend Michael Keelty. These are just some crowds in the 50s and 60s. And you can actually see there, especially on the photograph on the left and right, in fact, that there are plenty of women in the crowds. I do love the fact that, if you look at them all there, everyone's wearing jackets, ties, often felt hats, things like that. No football jerseys, no scarves even, or barely even a rosette and things like that. So people are dressed up almost like they're going out for dinner to the football matches to stand on the terraces of Dalymount. But you can see there was a huge mass appeal, and the bigger gates for football matches in Dublin in the 40s, 50s, 60s often topped 15 to 20,000, especially big rivalries with the likes of Drumcondra and Shamrock Rovers, which are huge rivals in the 50s and into the early 60s and so on. This was really popular mass entertainment. This is a great photograph as well. Terry Fagan found this one. This is the Gloucester Diamond. So basically now it's a kind of a playground and park on Sean McDermott Street, or Gloucester Street as it was then, hence the name Gloucester Diamond. This is a tarmac 7-a-side pitch. And you can see this is not professional football, but you can see the crowds of people there lined to watch the game. There is talks of players coming back from England on their summer holidays playing in matches. Dunphy talks about doing it. They're playing on those pitches. Ben Hannigan, who recently passed away, apparently used to always also play on matches here and up on Sheriff Street as well, the former Shelburne star. And these were, again, street football games, often contested by young men from the North Inner City, not far from Henrietta Street. But they grew. This is just a kickabout. But all these players would be known for their skill, their technical ability. Often small little guys from the North Inner City, but because they're playing with these awkward balls and bumpy pitches and in back lanes, had amazing ball control, and it was that sort of almost the bragging rights of the skill and ability and the tricks you had. And also you had to be tough and hard, obviously, as well. And just to bring it back to my own family there, the guy with the football on his lap, who's the captain there, is Gerard Farrell. He is my grandfather, and that photo is from 1936. That's the St. Xavier's team. Now, I was talking to Kate in preparation for these talks, and St. Xavier's would have been the local club of probably the residents of Henrietta Street. They were formed out as St. Xavier's Church on Dominic Street, and they actually won the Junior Cup in the 1950s. My father played for them as well. But again, like I said, it just goes to show the different variety of groups. So again, they were a football team associated with the local church, and I have other pictures of them which actually have some of the priests standing beside the players in their jerseys and things like that. So football teams grew out of almost every aspect of society within Dublin, despite occasionally official Ireland kind of looking down on football and things like that. Famously, Douglas Hyde was kicked out of the GAA because he attended, in his role as President of Ireland, an Irish international in the 1930s between Ireland and Poland. And I suppose at that time, the North Inner City produced great players, not just local heroes, but international heroes. So just going from top to bottom on that. So top left is Jackie Carey, or Johnny Carey as he is known in Britain, playing for Manchester United. And you can see the crowds there. The smaller circular picture is Paddy Moore, who was from, again, just around the corner from Croke Park, around Ballybock, the man who scored 4 goals against Belgium in a World Cup qualifier, the star forward for Shamrock Rovers. Below him, Jimmy Dunn, who was from Ringsend, a man who still holds goal-scoring records in the top flight of English football. A man who scored, 30 goals plus 3 years in a row in the top division in England for Sheffield United, won a league title with Arsenal. And bottom left there, Johnny Giles of Ormond Square, in his Man United days before, obviously, the great success he had with Leeds United as well. So Dublin is producing stars of, really a global quality. I mean, Jackie Carey was the second person to be named Player of the Year. He captained the rest of the world against Great Britain 11 and so on. So these were really top-class international quality players, and they were local heroes. And all these guys came from basically Dublin, and most of them from in around inner city Dublin. Now, the other issue is as well, a lot of these players, like the likes of Paddy Moore never played professionally in England. Irish football was competitive enough because in Britain there was a maximum wage. So it varied a little bit, but it went from about £7 a week in the 1930s up until about £10 a week in kind of the post-war era. And there was a maximum wage in place up until 1961. So basically, while this was decent money, I think about £10 a week was roughly at the time in Britain was about twice the average national wage. It meant that if you were getting 20,000 plus into Milltown or Talca and so on, you could afford to pay decent enough wages to keep players at home. So the financial incentive that is huge now for a young lad to go over to England wasn't necessarily as prevalent. And of course, people didn't have TVs. We didn't have 7 nights a week of televised football. So the stars were the people you saw in Dalymount and Talca and Milltown and so on. That begins to change after the 1960s, the financial incentive and also the rise of basically television begins to change how we perceive football. And I'm coming towards the end now, but that's where we're going next. So, as I said, we were talking about those great peaks, the crowds of 20,000 plus in the 50s and 60s. Really, that begins to change. The maximum wage, as I said, is abolished in 1961. There's now a greater financial incentive. Famously, Johnny Haynes, the captain of Fulham, goes from £10 a week to £100 a week, basically either side of that maximum wage being abolished. Now, Fulham do that almost as a PR measure, but it works. It shows that you can make big money for the time playing football professionally in England, at least at the very top end of the game. And of course, TV means that the Irish public is now exposed to more and more games. So in 1958, there's 20,000 sets in the whole country. By 1966, when there's a lot of interest in the World Cup, which is being held in England, it's one of the first times that football is really in a mass televised way going to be watched by a huge amount of people. There's 500,000 sets in Ireland, and then obviously people are crowding into neighbours' houses to watch the match and so on. And of course, the fact that it's being held in England, the fact that England win it, creates a lot of interest in football, and also the stars of that team. People want to watch Bobby Charlton or Alan Ball then, or Jeff Hurst. They want to see more of that. Of course, Match of the Day appears. It begins to televise in the 1960s. It goes in colour in 1969. And then, of course, you see the last picture there, the famous photograph of Pele and Bobby Moore, the 1970 World Cup. It's in colour. It's in Mexico, the sunshine, the glamour. It seems a long way from Dalymount Park or Talca. And it glamorizes and brings international football, and British football especially, more immediately into people's homes. There was always people being fans of English football teams, especially associated with Irish players over there. There's stories in Dominic Behan's book about Russell Street having an Everton supporters club in the 1930s. That was at a time when another North inner city footballer, a guy called Alex Stevenson, was starring for Everton. And guys used to go over on boat trips to see Everton play at Goodison and so on. But this became much more of a thing, I suppose, when people had ready access to those clubs via TV, not just on occasional visits to Dublin. And then, of course, the city itself has changed. That middle picture is Finglas being developed in the 1970s. So a lot of these clubs that had huge support in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as new housing estates are built in, I'm using Finglas as an example, it could be Blanchetown, it could be Tala, people are moving out of the cities and the inner suburbs. And when they move out, there's a disconnect with where they used to live, and there's a disconnect with their old teams. So what they do when they move into these new locations, they set up their own clubs. And instead of supporting Bows or Rovers or Shells or Drums even, people are founding their own teams in their own localities, and that's where they're putting their energy. So they're not League of Ireland clubs, they're their local Leinster Senior League team, and maybe their son or daughter plays for them and so on. So again, these connections are severed with clubs. The rise of kind of popular media and TV means that the League of Ireland boom, the live football boom that maybe existed in Dublin begins to fritter away. And look, it wasn't helped by a lot of people failing to adapt in terms of modernizing stadia and other promotions of the game as well. So it's something that I suppose League of Ireland is still dealing with now. And I'm just finishing up now, and I want to take a few minutes to take your questions as well. So, like I said, that's my whistle-stop tour of about 90 years of football and how it's changed and how the city has changed and how it's gone from a game that was played by everyone in back streets and back lanes and probably is still today, thankfully. But I'd love to hear your own stories, your own memories, any questions you have. If you want to see more, I've written extensively about football and a lot about Dublin football on my blog, The Bohemian Sporting Life. I have a podcast as well. And if you want to get in touch with me, Kate will explain how you can do that as well, because I'd love to hear from you as well. Whether you just were a fan, spectator, former player, whatever, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for that brilliant talk and some wonderful photos as well of the old teams. If anyone recognizes anyone in those photos or a relative or anything, let us know. And as Jerry said, he's always looking to hear from people who have football memories. So the best way to get in touch, I imagine, if you have those memories, is maybe through us, Jerry, and then we can forward them on to you. Would that be the best way to do it? Or is there another way you prefer? Okay, grand. So email us if you would like to get in touch with Jerry, and we'll pass you on to him. I'm going to stop your screen share there, Jerry, if I may. Bear with me a sec. So this is your chance, everyone, to ask Jerry a few questions if you have any. You can use the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen there. and we will try to get to as many as we can. So I will start off with this one from David, who says, was Shelbourne Park, the Greyhound track, ever used by Shelbourne FC? I always think a Leinster Senior League club could be played there.
They were indeed, yes. They did play there. Like I said, that the famous game in 1913 where there was a mini riot around the time of the Dublin lockout was actually to inaugurate Shelbourne playing in Shelbourne Park. They had done up the ground, and it was basically an inauguration match, a friendly between Bows and Shells. So they did play there early on in their life. I understand they left because basically they fell out with the owners. They didn't own the ground themselves. They fell out with the owners about basically rent that they were expected to pay. And obviously Shells then had a bit of a migratory existence. Obviously they're now playing at Talca Park, which is quite a bit away from where they came from. Like I said, being formed in what is now Slattery's pub there on the corner of Shelbourne Road and Bath Avenue. There's great description of when Shelbourne won the Irish Cup, when it was, which was an All-Ireland Cup in the early, the first decade of the 1900s. I think it was 1906 they won it. And that coming back to Ringsend, and people had these burning tar barrels rather, to welcome them back, and there was bonfires and all that, celebrating the fact that they were the first Dublin team to win the cup and bring it back to Dublin. So yes, it was very much a Shelbourne's original home, really. Although now I suppose they've been at Talca for so long, they developed their own support on the north side as well, especially around the likes of Coolock and Artane and so on.
Brilliant, thank you. Brian asks, thanks for your talk, Gerard. Hope you'll take a question from a Rovers supporter. My late father told me when I was a young lad that my grandfather was a Bows fan. My grandfather was in the British Army, and my dad always maintained that Bows had a great British Army following. It would have been in the early 1900s. How true do you think that was? He said their popularity was down to Bows' amateur status. Your thoughts?
There is certainly truth to that. Now, I don't know if it was down to amateur status, but Bows, when they were founded in 1890, had a disparate group of founders. So some of the folks who founded Bows were associated with a civil service training college called Bell's Academy. Some were associated with the medical profession. They were medical students. There were a few other lads who were just, they were draper's assistants, and they were just working class lads learning a trade. But there were a small group associated with something called the Hibernian Military School, which is basically, if you know St. Mary's Hospital in the Phoenix Park, it was basically a military training school. That's kind of a sad history. It was set up basically to train the orphans of dead British soldiers into becoming soldiers themselves. Now, by the time the students there were involved with Bohemians, they were basically training for a life in the army. They didn't have to be orphans, thankfully, and things like that. So they were involved, and I've done a piece of research myself. So about 40 plus people involved with Bohemians served in the First World War, and some were actually quite, senior military people and were quite successful. But that wasn't unique at the time, because I did similar bits of research into Shelbourne and Shamrock Rovers, and again they had large numbers of players and members who were associated with the British Armed Forces. Unsurprisingly, Shamrock Rovers more the Royal Navy because of the nature of where Shamrock Rovers were. Again, Ringsend, a lot of people had a background. They had, growing up by the docks, they had, they knew seafaring and things like that. So that wasn't uncommon. And if you think about it, I think the figure something like close to 50,000 people from Dublin fought in the First World War. So it would be unusual if, and again, mostly from working class communities. So it'd be unusual if those people weren't also involved in football clubs. Shells, Bows, and Rovers being the kind of three the biggest at the time, it's unsurprising that they had members in the British Army. And there's actually big, almost advertisements or kind of tribute pieces in the Evening Herald around the time during the First World War, listing all the players who are off serving, in the trenches and so on.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming in here, so I don't know if we'll have time to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So the next question here is from Philip. Hi, Jerry, very interesting. I'm interested in the grounds these early 1890s to 1920s teams played in. Were they largely sporting fields, or did they have actual stadiums, stands, or terraces? Thanks.
It's an interesting question. I'll use Bows as an example, but I can give a few more. Well, Shamrock Rovers, for example, they basically played in the park that is there now, the park in Ringsend. They were open pitches. Bows started off playing in the Phoenix Park around where the polo grounds are. And, when they were able to get a lease or buy a piece of ground kind of later on, then they began to develop them up. Some of those early teams, freebooters, that I mentioned, they played on ground around now what is kind of Simmons Court in the RDS. So again, they're open grounds that were relatively flat and dry and could be cordoned off. But say once Bows moved into Dalymount in 1901, what they did was they started banking up banks of earth to make simple terraces. They were able to put a fence around the ground, and once you put a fence around the ground, that's important because then you can charge people admittance. You make a bit of money from the crowds, and then you can reinvest that into building up. So it was a very much a gradual process. You got a piece of ground, you could fence it off, you could charge admittance, and then gradually you invest in facilities. First of all, it started off with simple banks of earth. Then eventually they started building terraces and that. So say even with Dalymount, the stands built in the 20s in Dalymount were actually designed by Archibald Leach, who's one of the most famous stadium architects in the world, designed Villa Park, Ibrox, Goodison Park, Craven Cottage, and so on. So, I mean, by the 20s, you have kind of world famous architects coming over here to help design grounds and things like that.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that are kind of similar here, so I might ask you to take them together. The first one says, "Hi Jerry, thanks for a fantastic talk, really enjoyable. Can you speak a bit more on how the geography of the city may have impacted on the growth of football, social divisions, pockets of interest in particular areas? How did the establishment of local clubs impact the inner city clubs?" And the next one, slightly different but similar, were there any street games or formats of the game specific to Dublin in the 50s, 60s or 70s?
Very interesting question. The person who I think has done the best work on how the development of the outer suburbs, to use those words, or that were kind of developed from the 70s kind of onwards, affected cities, is a guy called Robert Redmond, who did some excellent pieces on that. And if I can find it, I might actually share one of the articles he wrote. Again, because he looked at population demographics. So his argument, and it's one I think has a fair bit of truth in it. I mean, there's lots of reasons why crowds dropped off from clubs that are more associated with town and the inner suburbs. The rise of television, the rise of popularity of clubs in Britain, the mismanagement of football in Dublin for many reasons, the lack of investment in facilities and so on. But I do think the fact that the further people moved out, and often they didn't have great public transport services, the further people move out, they invented their own clubs, their own new connections. So instead of going in, as I say, if you moved out to Crumlin, say, for example, or beyond out to Ballyfermot, say, maybe you're not going every week to see Pats or Rovers or whatever, but you're going to, help the team that you've set up there for your kids to play in, and that's going to take up whatever free time you have to devote to football. That's what you're devoting it to, and I think that has a big impact. There's a lot of other factors, but I do think it's one: the demographic shift and urban sprawl, for want of a better word. And you look, like, there's some great clubs in the outer suburbs, and they're all, take a lot of effort, a lot of volunteerism. That eats up a lot of people's time. So maybe they don't have the time on a Friday night to go see their League of Ireland club. They might still retain an affection for them, but they mightn't be as involved with that club anymore. The other question, it's a tough one, and really the answer is I don't know if there was specific games. I've read some of the oral testimonies you've sent to me, Kate, and I've done my own bit of research about just in kind of books that people have written about their own experiences growing up in Dublin and kind of social histories and that. A lot of the games you would recognise, but they're fairly simple ones, heads and volleys, and games based on the curbs or squares of paths and things like that. They all have different names depending on which part of the city you're in, but they're all identifiable really. But I don't think they're necessarily Dublin or unique to Dublin. But I do think, and it's not just Dublin as well, any city, the architecture and the built environment suits football better than other sports because it's easy to play, it's cheap to play, and it's accessible to play.
Thank you. I might just, in answer to that last question about the specific nature of football in Dublin, 14 Henrietta Street wrote a blog about what we'd learned from the oral histories, memories of people playing football as children in the streets. And I think the one thing that stood out was just the size of the teams, sometimes 20, 20 aside, in the middle of the street. So I'm going to pop that link in the chat box there. So feel free to take a read if you're interested. I think we've got time for one or two more, and then we'll wrap up. So a question here from David: can you speak more to soccer at the schools level? Was it quite plain that the schools like Castleknock College abandoned soccer for rugby because of class associations?
To my knowledge, yes. I think it's almost explicit. I think it's from one of the yearbooks, I think 1910, where it's basically considered a it is quite, yeah, it's considered, it's a class basis, that this is kind of seen to be less of an elite game, and we basically have an idea that we are a more elite institution. And that's not just them. I think Clongowes around the same time as well. Clongowes Wood College in Kildare produced a lot of quality footballers. And again, a lot of this was basically that end of the 19th century thing, where kind of wealthy families in Dublin would send their kids off to basically these quite prominent, mostly Catholic public schools, specifically Catholic public schools in Britain. Over there, they got very much involved in this very prominent sports culture, this kind of Tom Brown school days idea of sport as a moral good. And they brought back association football, and then a lot of those people became involved in later as teachers in private schools here in Ireland, and then they brought that with them. But then that moved quite quickly just to focus on rugby. And I mean, that I have a quote there from Todd Andrews. He kind of dissects social class in Dublin in the early 20th century based on people's interests and pastimes, and he actually breaks it down by what sport you play based on your class background, and the people who play croquet versus the people who play cricket versus the people who play rugby. And he's quite humorous on it, but he's that's just one viewpoint. But yeah, I think there is a move away from the beginnings of seeing association football as being the corner boys game. I'm surprised that word crops up again and again, the use of the word corner boys. And I think in the stories that in oral histories you mentioned, Kate, there's this idea of kids playing street football, and then jackets getting confiscated by the Gardaí, and children being taken away by what I think I've seen referred to as the cruelty man, basically the kind of child welfare people, although I think that name is deceptive. So it very quickly gets looked down upon in two ways, I suppose. It gets looked down upon by certain people, and it's not all people in the GAA, but there's certain people in the GAA or an official Ireland sort of thing, as this is a West Brit sort of garrison game. And then you have other people looking down on it from a class point of view, basically saying, right, the games of our class are rugby or cricket or so on, and we look down on football, most of the working class sort of game. But you look at it now, it's still the most popular participant sport in the country. There's over 500,000 people play football regularly at some occasion throughout the state, which is huge numbers. And I almost feel we've done the sport a disservice, because you can see the mess that the FAI have been in recent years, and they haven't helped themselves. But really, you look at the support that other sports get, and often very small minority sports, you could argue things like greyhound racing get, and the government support, and yet football sees very little of that, even before the recent kind of controversies with the FAI. That's just my opinion now. Of course, I'm biased.
Thank you. One of our last questions before we wrap up. 2021 is the centenary of the League of Ireland founding by the 8 Dublin clubs. Are there any events or celebrations planned?
Like I said in the intro, I do a little bit of stuff for the Ireland match programs and some of the stuff for the League of Ireland websites and so on. And I've been told there are centenary plans, yes. I did write a piece that was commissioned for the FAI Cup final, which was the 100th final. And I did I might share it. It's a piece about the first holding of the FAI Cup and so on, which was run by St James's Gate, which is kind of fascinating when it was obviously held kind of in the gap between the War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. And it went to a replay between St James's Gate and Shamrock Rovers. And it's quite a testy game. And St James's Gate won the cup, and the Rovers players chased the St James's Gate players into the dressing rooms. And Charlie Dowdall, who's on the St James's Gate team, was about to be attacked apparently by a couple of Rovers players, one called Bob Fulham and one called Dinny Doyle. And Charlie Deadall's younger brother John was in the IRA, and he pulled out a gun basically to protect his brother, and that ended the hostilities. So it was a very it's a time of great upheaval and so on. But there are, I don't know the details, but I've been told there are going to be events to mark the league, and I think individual clubs are going to do that as well. But I don't have details, but I've been told there will be. Look, I think we're all just hoping that the league actually kicks off in March, as we hope it will, because of all the pandemic issues, and hopefully before the end of the season we get back into the grounds and able to watch live football again.
Yeah, here. Our final questions then before we wrap up are actually two that are similar. They're kind of like a Bose trivia quiz for you, Gerry. So I hope you're ready. So the first one is, would you happen to know when the first match was under floodlights in Daly Mount Park? And the second one, thanks for the talk, really enjoyable. So much was in interest, but on a personal level, I learned that I've played myself on the same pitch as George Best, having played on the Coffee Acre in the mid-90s. Perhaps I missed it, but how was the name Bohemians chosen?
Okay, interesting questions there. Yes, we do know when the first match under floodlights was. It was in March 1962. The opposition were Arsenal. I've written an article about this. Bose obviously installed the floodlights. If you think about it, you're going to an international match. It's in February and March, something like that. International matches previously were held midweek, kind of early in the afternoon, because you had to use natural light. There was no floodlight. So you're playing Irish International World Cup qualifiers at 3 PM when most people are at work. So if you wanted to go to the match, you had to take a half day. Floodlights were a necessity. And it was, Bose actually funded, almost what we call crowdfunded. They did a big fundraising campaign for a number of years, going back, I think, to late 59, early 60, to raise £20,000 to buy the floodlights from a Scottish company who had also done the floodlights for Hampden Park and Easter Road and other places. They were installed in early 1962, and the first match was a game against Arsenal. Originally, Bose wanted to bring over a selection of Irish players playing in the English First Division, but they couldn't arrange to get releases for all the other players. They tried a couple other teams, Man United and Wolves, I think, but they were involved in the FA Cup action. So I think Arsenal were like their third choice or something like that. And on the back of that, a completely false myth emerged that we had bought the floodlights from Highbury, Arsenal's own ground, which is completely untrue. If you're ever in Highbury before they demolished it, they never had floodlight pylons. They always had rooftop lights. So that was the first floodlit game in Dalymount. Honourable mention though to Talca Park. Talca Park had floodlights before Dalymount. Talca Park had floodlights from the late 50s, back when it was home of Drumcondra, and it was Sam Prohl, who was also previously involved in Dundalk, made a big outlay and purchased floodlights for Talca Park. So they were actually the first League of Ireland ground to have floodlights in the late 50s. And there was another question, how Bose got the name, was it?
That's right, yeah.
Yes. It's an interesting one. No one is 100% sure. The story is that there were a number of different names suggested, and there was a split. And Dudley Hussey, as the initial club secretary, had a casting vote, and he chose Bohemians. Now, some people say the other name chosen was Rovers. Now, there's a couple of different ideas. There's this idea Bohemians or Rovers because they were traveling around a lot, looking for grounds, things like that. My own take is Bohemians was chosen because it was very popular in the language at the time. So there was a Michael William Balfe opera called The Bohemian Girl, which was hugely popular in the late 19th century. There was a lot of this kind of romantic notion of Bohemia, which is obviously now probably modern part of the Czech Republic. So I think it was a name that was very popular and very kind of romantically associated in the popular culture at the time. And it was picked as a good name. And it wasn't, there was the Bohemian cinema even in Phibsborough, if people remember that. Some older viewers might remember that. So it was quite a common name, and the Bohemian Girl being quite a famous opera and song and so on. So it was quite common. It was in the popular culture. It was in the lingo at the time. So there's stories that Bohemians, the gypsies, the wandering gypsy idea that Bows were moving around from place to place to get a game. That's one suggestion. I think it's more just the fact that the idea and notion of Bohemians and being slightly unconventional and a bit different was in the popular culture at the time, and the young lads who were mostly 18, 19, 20 at the time kind of thought it was a cool name. That's my take on it. We'll probably never know for definite, but that's, from all the research I've done, that's the best I can tell.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And sorry to everyone, we couldn't quite get to all of the questions there. We'll have to wrap up now and let you all get to your dinner. We had a few memories being shared in the Q&A, which was absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much, everyone. And if you do want to share your football memories with Jerry or your tenement memories with 14 Henrietta Street, you can email memories@14henriettastreet.ie. We're always looking to hear more stories from the tenements. So we will wrap up there, and thank you again so much, Jerry. Absolutely brilliant talk this evening. As I said at the start, this will be recorded, so we'll share that on our channels over the next few weeks, hopefully. And our next talk is exactly 2 weeks from today at 7 p.m, and that is going to be Joe Mooney from the East Wall History Group, talking about workers' housing in the Docklands. Docklands being another really important part of tenement life. So the tickets will be available for that from tomorrow, I believe, and they're all free. Again, we've got another, loads of more great talks coming up. So hopefully we will see you again at more of those. So thank you again, Jerry, so much, and thank you all for coming along. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.